This is a video about an extended visit to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, or North Korea as it is more commonly known. The total trip went from Canada to Beijing and thence to Pyongyang. I left the DPRK by train for Vladivostok and then flew to South Korea before flying home. It was fascinating to see the mantle of winter still covering Alaska, the Bering Sea, and the Russian Far East. Coming in to land at the Beijing International Airport, we flew over what seemed to be an endless series of high-rise buildings. After arriving in Beijing, I spent 24 hours waiting in Terminal 2 for the flight to Pyongyang. Tours are tightly controlled and most focus heavily on the showpiece capital city of Pyongyang. Per normal, my tour also included a visit to the Demilitarized Zone. However, as it was an extended tour, it also went to the northeast corner of the DPRK, to the Tri-Country area near the Rason Special Economic Zone, where the DPRK, China and Russia conjoin. We flew from Beijing to Pyongyang on North Korea's national airline, Air Koryo, the lowest ranked airline in the world, and the only carrier to have a 1-star quality rating on Skytrax. However, the experience was acceptable, with the only problem being the aircrew's prohibition on taking photos. It was made clear that killing devices could not be brought into the DPRK. As I was flying towards the DPRK, the U.S. Navy also decided to visit the DPRK by steaming the USS Carl Vinson Strike Group to waters off the Korean Peninsula in response to the DPRK's ballistic missile testing. We were the only passenger-bearing plane at the Pyongyang airport, and we immediately knew that we were in a time warp given all the old Soviet-era airplanes around the field. The new terminal was nice, but empty of passengers save for ourselves. Passing through customs at the airport took a while, as the customs people were concerned about any printed material being brought into the country. However, they were not so much concerned about cell phones, cameras, and computers. Once through customs, there was time to watch a traffic policewoman directing the little traffic that arrived at the airport. There seemed to be little purpose to her job, but traffic policewomen are popular with tourists given their highly choreographed moves and their winsome nature. Traffic policewomen are commonly found in Pyongyang, while in other major cities this role is performed by traffic policemen. Pyongyang is a city of some 3.5 million people, which is being rapidly transformed into a futuristic-looking showcase city with the patina of prosperity. With its new construction and monumental buildings, the city is the ultimate totalitarian metropolis. It was built mostly from scratch following its destruction in the Korean War. The smog from the coal-fired electricity plants frequently blankets Pyongyang, which both obscures the view and impacts residents' health. The people hanging off the bus serve to underline the transportation issues in the DPRK. The Three Revolution exhibition is a museum housed in a building that looks like the planet Saturn. The exhibition primarily showcases the three revolutions of Kim Il-sung, namely the ideological, technical, and cultural revolutions. The Korean War is featured prominently in the regime's propaganda to keep it fresh in people's minds. The Cholima is a Chinese mythical flying horse whose name means thousand-mile horse, referring to its ability to travel 1,000 miles in a single day. In the DPRK, the Cholima is used to promote rapid economic growth. The Arch of Triumph was inaugurated on the occasion of Kim Il-sung's 70th birthday in 1982 to honor and glorify his role in the Korean armed resistance to the Japanese occupation from 1925 to 1945. Pyongyang is home to a large number of impressive public buildings, including the teepee-shaped ice rink, the massive pyramid-shaped Yanggakdo Hotel, and the circular Mangyongdae People's Theater. The parachute-shaped Mayday Stadium holds some 114,000 spectators, making it one of the largest stadiums in the world. Ryongyang New Town contains newly completed apartment buildings that were completed in a matter of months, raising questions of poor construction. Although the traffic is light, the traffic police are still exposed to dangers as they stand in the road. The April 25 House of Culture is a theater that has hosted Korean Worker Party congresses. Public transportation includes a mix of buses, trolleys, trains, a subway, and taxis for the rich. However, these are very crowded at peak hours, and most people either walk or bicycle around the city. From the Pyongyang train station, we took a ride on a vintage old trolley bus. The bus was driven by a retiree whose trolley was painted with numerous red stars, one for each 5,000 kilometers of accident-free driving. He even has a ring inscribed with the signature of Kim Jong-Il presented on retirement. The conductor on the bus was the driver's wife, and they had worked together for years. Our vintage bus was near empty, while the real buses were packed at rush hour. The ubiquitous lapel pins worn on the left side of the chest serve to indicate the status of the wearer in the Workers' Party, with the dual portrait pin having more status than the old single portrait pin. We rode on the north-south Cholima line and stopped at several of its stations to see the extravagant decorations a la Moscow Metro. The Pyongyang Metro consists of two lines that were built in the 1970s. The Pyongyang Metro is among the deepest metros in the world, with its tracks over 110 meters deep underground, such that its stations can double as bomb shelters in the event of war. Most of the rolling stock was bought in 1997 from Germany's Berlin U-Bahn Metro. The Pyongyang metro stations are attractive, but not as wonderful as those on the Moscow Metro, which served as their inspiration. The Pyongyang Metro is inexpensive for riders and seems well run, but the 110-meter deep underground stations cause long elevator rides both to get down to the stations and to get back up to the surface. We exited the metro via a 3-minute ride up the long escalator. The impressive Arch of Triumph lies outside the station entrance. Buildings on this street were impressively put up in only 2 years at what is called Pyongyang speed. However, the use of inexperienced construction workers and engineers has led to accidents. In Pyongyang, we stayed at the Yanggakdo International Hotel on Yanggakdo Island, where tourists can be kept isolated from the local populace. This is the hotel that the U.S. student Otto Warmbier stayed at before he was arrested and subsequently fatally wounded by the actions of the DPRK. From the hotel room on the 37th floor, there are excellent views out over Pyongyang, smog permitting. In the hotel room, we could watch the latest North Korean crisis play out on Al Jazeera TV. The meals that we had in the hotel's restaurants were good and the decor pleasing, despite the restaurant's utilitarian names of Number 1 and Number 2 Restaurant. Tourists wanting to jog need to take a government minder with them who keeps an eye on them. The morning sweeping ritual uses small brooms to reinforce the subservience of the populace. With the hotel window open for air conditioning, the weird citywide wake-up music at 6 a.m. was clear, as well as the chanting from the Tai Chi mob across the river. Around our hotel was the never-ending stockpiling of gravel for Pyongyang's impressive construction boom, which is reportedly being financed by China. In towns and cities throughout the DPRK, there are groups of women waving red flags and beating on drums to encourage hard work for the regime. Whether the flag-waving women's groups motivate the masses to work hard was not clear, but perhaps the real purpose was simply to ensure the masses know that the government is omnipresent in their lives. The Victorious War Museum is a museum dedicated to the Korean War. The entranceway is monumental, as are the statues lining the walkway to the huge main museum building. This museum sees lots of military conscripts arriving to receive the regime's indoctrination about the heroic struggle of the Korean People's Army against the United States invaders and the soldiers of the American puppet regime in South Korea. The DPRK teaches its people that South Korea and the United States attacked the North first, so the DPRK says that it had to respond to liberate the nation. This despite the fact the Soviet archives, when opened for research in the early 1990s, showed quite clearly that the DPRK and the Soviets had actually planned the assault for the 25th of June 1950. As well, the DPRK has never shared the details with its people about the armistice that Pyongyang signed to halt the Korean War. Instead, the DPRK describes the 1953 cessation of hostilities as a supreme victory for its military over the United States and South Korea. Our best view of the Yanggakdo Hotel, or Mount Doom, was from the museum grounds. This hotel, started in 1987, remains an unfinished 100-story, 330-meter tall building. The exterior was completed in 2011, while the interior is unfinished, with no known completion date in sight. It's the most prominent feature of Pyongyang's skyline, and it is also the tallest unoccupied building in the world. Its current use is mainly as a very high location to mount telecom antennas. Visitors to the museum are greeted by a huge statue of a young Kim Il-sung, which looks surprisingly like Kim Jong-Un. Throughout the visit to the DPRK, there was little acknowledgement of the decisive role played by the Chinese People's Liberation Army and the Soviet pilots that flew the aircraft with either Chinese or North Korean markings during the Korean War. The dogma is that the People's Army won the war, which is patently wrong. The prized exhibit at the museum is the USS Pueblo, a U.S. naval ship that was captured by the North Korean forces when it allegedly entered North Korean territorial waters in 1968. One sailor was killed in the assault, and 82 were captured and held prisoner for 11 months before they were freed. The United States considers this ship to be hijacked. On board the USS Pueblo, the guide explained about the alleged crimes the ship and her crew were committing against the DPRK when they were captured. Before the outbreak of the Korean War, Joseph Stalin equipped the North Korean army with modern weapons that completely outclassed those of the South Korean army. The museum grounds include an interesting display of equipment used by the Korean People's Army during the Korean War, as well as a display of captured U.S. military equipment. The DPRK's T-34-85 tanks drove through the South Korean army as the latter had not been provided effective counter-weapons by the United States. The T-34s were only effectively countered when the United States Army arrived in Pusan with their heavy tanks. By the time of the armistice in 1953, the Korean People's Army had suffered some 150,000 men killed, the Chinese some 400,000 dead, and the United Nations some 180,000 dead. The inter-Korean border at the armistice remained essentially the same as it was before the war started. All able-bodied North Korean males aged 16 to 17 must begin mandatory service in the Korean People's Army that lasts for up to a decade. Women deemed fit must also serve, but for a shorter period, in the 1.2 million strong military, the world's fourth largest. As it was May Day, there were lots of red banners and DPRK flags set out around Pyongyang. The May Day holiday saw many of the city's citizens out in public venues, including the tennis courts at Kim Il-sung Stadium. May Day in Pyongyang's Moran Hill Park was brought to life with families and friends celebrating in the park with some seriously impressive lunch spreads and the smell of delicious barbecue smoke wafting throughout the air. Never seen a better family atmosphere than that at Moran Hill Park on May Day. We visited the Kaesong Youth Park, which is an amusement park opened in 1984 as part of the Arch of Triumph dedication. I went on a belly-down roller coaster imported from Italy that opened in 2010. Foreigners pay €5 for a ticket, which is far more than locals pay, but it moved us to the head of the long line. The government thought that one amusement park visit wasn't enough for us, so the guides took us to the Mangyongdae Funfair, some 12 kilometers on the outskirts of Pyongyang. The Funfair was refurbished following a 2012 visit by Kim Jong-Un. The rides are traditional yet fun for the elites and their children, although the theme of missiles and the military predominates. Leaving the funfair, we return to the propaganda of Pyongyang. Giant murals showing the wonderful beneficence of the Kims are seen throughout Pyongyang and the rest of the DPRK. The palatial Mangyongdae SchoolChildren's Palace hosts shows put on by extremely well-trained children. The children of the elite and the young pioneers are chosen to attend classes at the palace. Although it's palatial, there was no running water in the washroom sinks. The children's show started peacefully enough but ended up on a dark note with the typical celebration of the DPRK's ballistic missiles. To earn more foreign currency, the DPRK offers helicopter tours over Pyongyang starting from the international airport. Except for our small group of 10 people, the airport was completely deserted. We made the sightseeing flight in an old Soviet-era Mi-17 helicopter, which was luxuriously kitted out for VIP passengers. As we could clearly see from the helicopter, Pyongyang is a city of high-rises, so elevators are important for occupants. We were told that the DPRK policy on elevator service in residential buildings is to have no elevators for buildings less than 10 stories, 1 elevator for buildings between 10 and 20 stories, and 2 elevators for buildings over 20 stories. This policy makes living in high-rises a challenge. At the spectacular Pyongyang Circus Theater, we watched the internationally renowned Pyongyang National Circus perform a show that included a lot of unique flying trapeze routines. Per normal, it wasn't long in the show before the DPRK's ICBMs were highlighted. However, the rest of the show was very entertaining, with music being played by a live orchestra. The performers start a selection process from the age of 9 and follow 9 years of rigorous training. Driving around the city core, one passes by many impressively architected showpiece buildings. There were many newlywed couples being photographed near a restaurant cruise boat on the Taedong River opposite the Juche Tower. The 170-meter-high Juche Tower on the eastern bank of the Taedong River opposite the Kim Il-sung Square was completed in 1982 to celebrate the anniversary of Kim Il-sung's 70th birthday. The 30-meter-high statue in front of the Juche Tower consists of three figures: an intellectual with a calligraphy brush, a worker with a hammer, and a peasant with a sickle. This represents the combination that gives the DPRK its strength. The giant Kim Il-sung Square was constructed in 1954 as part of a plan to reconstruct the capital after its destruction in the Korean War. Unfortunately, there was no military parade while we were there, but RT filmed a recent one celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Korean War, which conveys the idea of how impressive these parades are. The giant signs atop the buildings around the square are impressive. We also visited the Grand People's Study House on the square. This building is the Central Library and it was built in 1982. It is the National Center for the Juche Studies. As well, the library has many computer rooms with modern computers providing access to the DPRK's national intranet, but not the internet, as access to the global network is restricted to only a small number of trusted people. There were many interesting views to be had from the study house, including that of the towering Changjiang Apartments, or Pyongyang as the area is sometimes called. The two large portraits of the Kims, which we had seen earlier, were now covered by giant white sheets. It was fascinating to watch the traffic policewoman performing a superfluous job near the square. These women are now a tourist attraction and have a couple of foreign websites devoted to them. Even at midday, there's little vehicular traffic in Pyongyang. Rather, there is a lot of bike traffic carrying goods and people. We were taken to see the Jangchong Cooperative Farm just outside of Pyongyang. This farm is deemed to be a model and a shining example of progress. However, on the way there, we passed by fields being worked by the army and peasants who live in old farmhouses. The central square had a mural of Kim Il-sung standing in a cabbage patch giving directions to the farmers. All around the square were paths with not so much as a speck of dirt. These paths led to identical houses.
The Marshal Kim Jong-Il has been here in June 2014.
We visited the farm's primary school to see a classroom of singing children who had clearly been visited before by tourists. The only thing missing from this model farm were farmers. There was no evidence of the 3,000 people who supposedly live in this cooperative, although we did visit a retiree's house. Overall, it felt like a Potemkin village. The farm has rows of greenhouses that the DPRK hopes will reduce seasonal food shortages that continue to affect large portions of the population. We visited a department store for the elites where all manner of foreign goods are available despite the UN sanctions. Pyongyang is a city of some 3.5 million people which is rapidly being transformed into a futuristic-looking city with the patina of prosperity. However, it is only when we left this city of Oz that it becomes clear that this image of prosperity is largely an illusion for most of the DPRK's citizens. Since once outside of Pyongyang, the countryside is being extensively farmed by peasant farmers and army draftees, mostly using farming techniques little changed since the time of the pharaohs. While there are a few vintage tractors, most of the plowing is performed by oxen, which are followed up by peasants either hand planting or broadcasting seeds. Given the DPRK's policy of Juche, agriculture is theoretically of utmost importance. However, as the widespread use of oxen and hand seeding together with the lack of the use of fertilizer shows, little investment is actually made to improve farming methods to increase yields. Investment appears to be largely reserved for improving Pyongyang and advancing the country's nuclear and ICBM programs. The cult of the Kims is perhaps the most extraordinary feature of the DPRK. Images or statues of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-Il are found everywhere. These graven images are effectively worshipped, despite the biblical warning that thou shalt not bow thyself down to them, nor serve them. However, in the DPRK, one would be in serious trouble if one didn't follow the protocol for the masses that reinforces the requirement to abase oneself before the images of the Kims. Bicyclists must dismount and walk their bikes when passing in front of the Kim statues. Couldn't visit the giant Kim statues in Pyongyang as access to them was mysteriously prohibited. However, we were able to see a complete Kim veneration ceremony to the big statues in Haeju. This ceremony lasted an hour and included numerous groups taking turns sweeping in front of the statues, followed by a deep group bow to them. The overall effect of the ceremony was to have the participants completely abase themselves to the statues and all that they represent. After the veneration of the Kims, the next most important dogma for the people to believe is that since the Korean War, the DPRK must stand ready to defend itself against the United States military and the soldiers of the American puppet regime in South Korea. Hence, no sacrifice is too great for the people to make, and it's why the DPRK must develop nuclear-tipped ICBMs to keep the invaders at bay. This dogma results in the Songun policy, which is the military-first policy of the DPRK, prioritizing the Korean People's Army in affairs of state and allocation of resources. On several occasions, we were marched up in front of either images or statues of the Kims. However, while the rest of the group bowed down to the Kims, I could not bow down to them and the odious ideology that they represent.
Attention, everyone. Let's all give thanks to the leader for this glorious day.
The leader is good! The leader is great! We surrender our will as of this date!
At night, a soldier patrols in front of the statues, and the Kims are illuminated in a brilliant light, despite the DPRK being an electricity-poor country. A nighttime satellite image shows how starved the DPRK is of electric light.
Same driver, same bus. And the other 16 friends who have the city tour who go on until...
Returning to our hotel in the evening, we pass by well-lit showcase buildings. The 150-meter-tall Juche Tower celebrates the ideology of Juche introduced by Kim Il-sung. Juche, or self-reliance, is the official state ideology of North Korea, which basically justifies the country's extreme isolationism and oppression of its people. Each night we were confined to our hotel, but we could look out over the dark Pyongyang with its minimal lighting and traffic. The scarcity of automobiles and fuel means that most of the movement of people and their goods is either by bicycle or foot. Along Mire, or Future Scientist Street, are newly constructed residential buildings that look great from the outside, but reportedly suffer from a lack of power and water supply and incomplete construction that has left them languishing in a half-finished state. The images on the street emphasize the DPRK's ambitions for nuclear-tipped ICBMs. Nearby Future Scientist Street on Suk Islet is the brand new Science and Technology Center that was opened in 2015. It nominally acts as an e-library for scientific work and papers produced by North Korean scientists. This ominous atom-shaped building was astonishingly built in about a year. Groups visiting the center must venerate the painting of the Kims when they enter. There is a Big Brother feel to the Science and Technology Center. The first DPRK space missile holds pride of place in the center, serving to emphasize the DPRK's ICBM program. The DPRK's development of both nuclear weapons and ICBMs is impressive. Their programs are progressing apace, and they are probably now unstoppable. The use of the Science Center's computers for viewing cartoons would be amusing, except for the success achieved by the DPRK in ICBM development. The children's section of the complex is full of implements of war for the children to play with. From the hotel room on the 37th floor, there were excellent views out over much of the city. However, as we had to sleep with the window open for ventilation, the 6 a.m. wake-up music that is played across the city was both eerie and annoying. Leaving Pyongyang, we drove south in the waning light at the end of the day on the 4-lane reunification highway towards the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. We barely passed by another vehicle, and when we did, it was mainly an SUV belonging to the army. As we were traveling at sunset, it was obvious that the rural districts suffer from a lack of power. We stopped at the amazing Sohang Rest House, which stretches across the 4 lanes of the reunification highway. It was closed, so the guides woke up the attendants. In the morning, we continued our 175-kilometer drive down to the DMZ on the empty 4-lane reunification highway, which as it nears the DMZ has numerous anti-vehicle obstacles along it. Between Kaesong and the DMZ, we passed by a series of defense works, including bunkers and anti-vehicle obstacles. We passed by scenes of peasants and people pressed into toiling in the fields. Since the end of the Korean War in 1953, the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, has divided the Korean peninsula in half. Associated with the DMZ are hundreds of thousands of armed soldiers, miles of fences, countless anti-vehicle obstacles and minefields that make it the most militarized border on Earth. Amidst this highly militarized area, the DPRK runs a pleasant souvenir shop where we waited for a briefing before driving up to the border. This shop sells militant propaganda posters as well as candies, ginseng, and dolls. The irony was profound.
미국은 이미 오래전부터 빙산지대 남측 지역을 완전한 무장지대로 만들고 우리에 대한 군사적 도발을 끊임없이 감행해왔습니다.
But already in South Korea, the U.S. Army, they brought in a lot of heavy weapons, automatic weapons. So totally changed, South Korea is totally changed into their military base.
We entered the area of the DMZ through a narrow passage that was lined with anti-vehicle obstacles on either side, which were ready to be dropped into place should hostilities break out. Surprisingly, the Korean People's Army farms in the DMZ. We stopped at the Panmunjom Truce Village where on 27 July 1953 the Korean Armistice Agreement that paused the Korean War was signed after some 2 years of negotiations. Over a 48-hour period in July 1953, a building was constructed for the signing of the armistice. It has since been renamed by North Korea as the Peace Museum.
그래서 이 주행기가 미국의 조선 침략사가 망상을 걸고 한 주먹으로 오늘까지 이것에 남아있게 되었습니다.
The flag in the square box is the then New Sector Agreement.
The armistice agreement agreed to by the United Nations Command, the Chinese People Liberation Army, the North Korean People's Army, ended the fighting and established a 4-kilometer wide demilitarized zone along the armistice line, effectively dividing the Korea into two separate countries, namely North and South Korea. Our visit to the DMZ was filmed by an agent of the DPRK regime. We were taken to a balcony on a large building to look out over the JSA. The Joint Security Area, or JSA, is the only portion of the Korean Demilitarized Zone where North and South Korean forces stand face to face. The JSA is used by the two Koreas for diplomatic engagements. Although most troops and all heavy weapons were to be removed from the DMZ following the armistice, heavily armed forces had been stationed on both sides of the DMZ. Leaving the demilitarized zone, we drove north to Kaesong, the ancient capital of the Koryo Kingdom. After the post-World War II partitioning of the Korean peninsula along the 38th parallel, Kaesong fell into South Korea, but came under the North's control during the Korean War, becoming the only city to change hands during that conflict. Like other cities in the DPRK, Kaesong has lots of propaganda images and posters on its streets, including murals showing the miraculous roots of the Kim family. The Kaesong Old Town is one of the best preserved collections of traditional Korean-style buildings in all of Korea. As seen in other cities and towns, Kaesong streets were largely empty of vehicles, hence the traffic policemen stood idly by most of the time as pedestrians and cyclists streamed by them. We stayed in a completely artificial traditional village in Kaesong, and once we arrived we were locked into the village until we left in the morning. Most of the village's wooden posts were actually skillfully made from concrete to resemble the real thing. The accommodation was very basic because it was supposedly traditional. The meals were Korean food served in multiple courses along with local beer and bottled water. At night it was dark with little electric light, which made for some good star viewing. The scarcity of consumer goods means that even throwaway objects must be repaired. The Kaesong Folk Custom Hotel was popular with the army. As we prepared to leave in the morning, the village's stream was being cleaned up by a worker with a rake. Souvenir shops were everywhere that we stopped, including hotels, restaurants, museums, and tourist attractions. After the stop in the souvenir shop, the gates of the hotel were open, and we could exit our overnight prison into the streets of Kaesong on our bus. An army unit was venerating Kaesong's giant Kim statues that are placed prominently on a hill overlooking Kaesong. At night they are brilliantly illuminated as a reminder to the populace of who rules them. Propaganda in the DPRK is interesting for tourists. However, it is relentless for the population. We had lunch at the Jong-Il restaurant where dishes are served in small golden plated bowls. The number of dishes served symbolizes the rank of the person eating, with 12 being the highest rank of all. Before leaving Kaesong, we were taken to see the small stone Songjuk Bridge, which was built in 1290 during the Koryo dynasty, and the adjacent Songyang So-wang, a Confucian academy that was built in the 14th century. The degree of manual manicuring of grounds and fields in the DPRK is astounding. We were taken to a nearby souvenir shop. There was an endless parade of bicycles as people moved about Kaesong. Traffic police outside of Pyongyang are male, but their work remains largely superfluous given the very light vehicular traffic. Nearby Kaesong, we visited the tomb of King Kongmin, who was the 31st king of the Koryo dynasty and ruled from 1352 to 1374 AD. The king engaged geomancers, astrologers, and mathematicians to ensure that the site had good feng shui. The tomb was blasted open and looted by the Japanese in 1905. An axle fell off a trailer, blocking us on a bridge over a river beside a vile Sinchon massacre mural. The prolonged stoppage gave us a chance to see scenes of life in the country. The scenes on the river included a woman washing clothes, a man bathing, and a well-dressed man dragging for fish. That the well-dressed man spent time futilely dragging for fish indicated a shortage of food in the rural areas of the DPRK. In fact, nearly a third of the children under 5 show signs of stunted development because of food scarcity, according to the UN's World Food Program. As North Korea does not produce enough food to feed its people, it relies on donations to the WFP to make up the shortfall. In 2012, the DPRK reduced the minimum height requirement for military conscripts from 145 centimeters to 142 because the generation facing call-up was stunted by a famine in the 1990s. By way of contrast, the average height for South Korean boys of the same age is about 172 centimeters. We stopped to visit the Sokdam Ravine, which is a 30-mile drive west of Haeju. It is a tranquil place that is home to a 16th century Confucian academy named Suyangsan. The pretty grounds were used by a newlywed couple for a photo shoot. Their best man was happy to have his photo taken. Haeju, with a population of some 250,000 people and 2 giant New Kim statues, is the only port on the west coast of the DPRK that does not freeze over in the winter. The pace of life in the countryside is slow as there is little mechanization and the peasants move about either on foot or by bicycle. Most of the traffic on the bumpy rural roads was either foot or bicycle traffic, except for the new SUVs of government or army officials that whipped past us. The rural peasants live in communes and either walk or bike out to their appointed daily work site in the surrounding fields. During planting and at harvest time, army conscripts, city workers, and convicts are brought out to assist the farmers. The backward nature of the DPRK's agriculture was amazing, especially given the vast sums of money that the regime expends on its nuclear and ICBM programs. Suyangsan Falls is a 128-meter tall waterfall that slides down a steep granite face upon which has been deeply incised an ode to the Songun policy stating, "Long live the great army base policy." Sariwon is a city of some 300,000 people where we were taken to see the Sariwon Folk Custom Street that was constructed during the reign of Kim Jong-Il to display an ideal picture of ancient Korea. The catkins falling from the cottonwood trees made it appear to be snowing. The Sariwon Folk Custom Street was a popular site for newlyweds and commercial photographers to have a photo shoot. Sariwon was one of the few places where we saw a gas station. There was a good selection of foreign alcohol available for purchase at the restaurant despite the UN sanctions. Ominously, there were posters threatening Washington, D.C. with destruction by the DPRK's ICBMs. The Battle of Sariwon on 17 October 1950 resulted in the UN forces capturing the city. Near Sariwon is Mount Jongbang, which only rises 481 meters, but has many spots to enjoy beautiful landscapes, which is why it's so popular with artists and newlyweds having their photos taken. The south gate of the fort was destroyed during the Korean War and was rebuilt in 1968. The newlyweds were friendly and welcome having their photos taken by us.
신부가 꺼다놔 싹 냄새 맡아보라요. 먼저. 신부 곱다 신랑 쳐다본다.
As it was springtime, the blossoming trees were alive with butterflies and bees. It was the most interesting scene of nature that I saw in the DPRK. The Songbulsa Buddhist temple on the hillside was first built in 898 AD, but it is now just a tourist attraction. Alas, the streams and waterfalls were not running to enhance the wedding photos. The old film canisters made for interesting paint palettes. Leaving Mount Jongbang, we went to visit a model pig farm, but first stopped in a small village and watched a team of soldier builders and women working on a small building project.
They called experts to see why the building collapsed.
He's going to throw some more cement up. See, there he goes. See, and then catches it.
Oh my God, that was excellent.
Yeah, no, that's the neat
wow.
thing is watching this stuff. Anyway, they called an expert and?
They called the experts and they thought maybe that it was involved.
The town's propaganda wall was impressive, and its bar chart showed the town had met its goals. Nearing the pig farm, we had a great view over the hilly countryside, with signs on the hills exhorting farmers to turn grass into meat. Model pig farm was just that, a pig farm, but a nice one nonetheless. We stopped to see the Sinchon Massacre Museum, which has the most vile and disgusting exhibits that I've seen. The purpose of the museum is to support the DPR's claim that some 35,000 people were killed by American military forces over a 52-day period in 1950. However, no evidence is presented to support this claim, and many historians have concluded that any killing was the result of Korean-on-Korean violence. There was an old man present at the museum who claimed to have witnessed the massacre as a 4-year-old. His memory was unbelievably clear from such a young age, and his story was very well rehearsed. We saw a large group of North Koreans arriving for their schooling and hatred, and a subsequent visit to the revenge-pledging place. The Sinchon Massacre Museum is a national shrine used by a ruthless propaganda machine to fuel anti-American passions and to solidify support for the Kim regime. Mount Kual takes its name from the 9th month of the lunar calendar because it is considered particularly attractive in that month. We walked up to see the historic 9th century Wojan Buddhist temple, which is surrounded by mountains. The temple is now just a tourist attraction. Electricity for the temple complex is generated by a small water wheel on a babbling brook. Nampo is a seaport on the Yellow Sea, 50 kilometers southwest of Pyongyang at the mouth of the Taedong River. Its harbor is often used as the primary port for the reception of foreign food assistance to the DPRK. Like other cities in the DPRK, Nampo has a pair of new giant Kim statues for its Kim veneration ceremonies. The 8-kilometer-long West Sea Barrage, or dam, is located 15 kilometers west of the city of Nampo. The barrage keeps salt water from invading the Taedong River, ensuring that the river water can be used for irrigation while allowing small ships to navigate the river. It was completed in 1986 after 5 years of labor by over 30,000 soldiers and civilians. The DPRK considers it a major accomplishment. We saw anti-aircraft artillery located high on a hill overlooking the shipping locks. Trees lining the country roads are attractive and provide some shades, but for tourists they make taking photos from moving vehicles very difficult. On the return drive to Pyongyang, we again stopped at the Sohang restaurant that stretches across the reunification highway. Although we could buy snacks, there were no gas pumps, and in fact we never saw a service station on the reunification highway. The few motorists on the highway must go into a city or town to refuel. However, even in major cities, service stations are a rarity. Returning to Pyongyang, we passed by the attractive Arch of Reunification, which was built in 2001 to commemorate the Korean reunification proposals put forth by Kim Il-sung. We drove some 3 hours northeast of Pyongyang to Myohyangsan to see the International Friendship Exhibition Hall, where some 115,000 gifts from 188 countries that were given to the Kims are displayed. The roads outside of Pyongyang are bone-rattling, and these manual repairs make them worse. We passed by many scenes of oxen plowing the fields as we drove north. Apart from the inefficient plowing, the lack of fertilizer results in lower crop yields despite the hard work of the peasant farmers. We passed by a series of new hydroelectric dams on the Chongchong River that are being built to spur rapid development and try to address the fact that most people can only expect a few hours of electricity per day, unless they are among the most privileged elites in the country. Important facilities such as those involved in the country's nuclear program also receive a constant supply of electricity. The propaganda slogans about electricity include, "Electricity is the lifeline of the national economy," and "Let the whole party, the entire army, and all the people be enlisted to increase the electric power generation radically." There are many placer gold mining operations on the Chongchong River, including those using heavy equipment and dredges. The bumpy road was uncomfortable to ride over, and the sound was like that of the clicking of a train in the olden days. Finally, after a bumpy 3-hour drive, we arrived in Myohyangsan in time for lunch. In the entrance to the hotel where the restaurant was located, we were greeted by the Kims seated in front of their International Friendship Exhibition Hall, while outside the workers toiled in the sun. That the impressive vainglorious hall is buried inside a mountainside does cause one to wonder if the real purpose of the hall is a military one in the event of war. Our tour had a number of DPRK fellow travelers who reveled in seeing the wonders of the Kim-run DPRK and swallowed the DPRK's anti-American propaganda.
Please gently pull with one hand. Gently with one hand.
The purpose of the International Friendship Exhibition Hall is to show the visitor that the Kims are such great leaders that all the world pays them homage and proves the endless love and respect towards the great leader, Kim Il-sung. However, many of the gifts are tacky ones from obscure communist sycophants. Of the gifts from Africa, I'd seen many in tourist markets around the continent. The Chinese-made wax figures of the Kims were very lifelike, and the Kim's airplane in the fake hangar was very impressive. The area around Myohyangsan, or Mystery Fragrant Mountain, is beautiful and worth a visit, but the International Friendship Exhibition Hall was generally boring. As it was springtime, the trees and bushes were blossoming beautifully in contrast with the ugliness of the message on the militant propaganda signs. The Pohyon-sa temple was founded under the Koryo dynasty in 1024 AD. It was damaged in the Korean War and has been reconstructed. The temple has a wonderful setting in the mountains. The Gate of the Four Heavenly Kings, which is a standard component of Chinese Buddhist temples, had 4 gigantic figures of 4 Buddhist gods, each of whom watches over one of the cardinal directions of the world. After the temple visit, we had the chance to make a short hike up Mount Myohyang to a waterfall that was hosting a family picnic with karaoke. Leaving the beautiful mountains, we made the bumpy drive back to Pyongyang, past scenes of peasants plowing the fields at sunset, and work gangs working to repair the bumpy road by remelting asphalt in small fires that they had built alongside the highway. From Pyongyang, we flew northeast to see the infrequently visited Rason Special Economic Zone. In this area, we encountered a far more restrictive regime on what we could photograph. As well, the government guides were very strict and severely restricted our actions, which made for an unpleasant tour. Again, we were the only flight leaving from the Pyongyang International Airport. Our airplane was an old Aleutian 18, built in 1968. Unfortunately, we were not allowed to take photographs during the flight to Oran. The Orang Air Force Base where we landed is the headquarters for the People's Korean Air Force fighter pilot training. Unfortunately, we were not allowed to take photographs of the long row of Korean War era MiG-15s used for fighter pilot training. The United Nations World Food Program operates in the DPRK because the daily food ration of 18 million North Koreans remains at only 67% of the UN recommended amount. Again in the rural areas, we saw agriculture powered by peasants using oxen. Assistance to the peasant farmers in plowing and planting was afforded by army conscripts. We were taken to see a mushroom farm to demonstrate the boom in mushroom farms under the propaganda slogan stating, "Let us turn ours into a country of mushrooms by making mushroom cultivation scientific, intensive, and industrialized." The northeast coast of the DPRK has many beautiful long sandy beaches, but we are not permitted to enjoy them. The towns on these beaches have many small fishing boats that are part of the DPRK's program to increase the food supply with fish. Many of the beaches have coastal defense fortifications, some of which have eroded into the sea. There has been a boom in fishing under the propaganda slogan stating, "Modernize fishing vessels and implement and actively introduce advanced fishing methods," as well as the slogan stating, "Let this socialist country resound with the song of the big fish haul and be permeated with the fragrant smell of fish and other seafoods." The Chongjin Russian War Cemetery is one of 5 such cemeteries containing the remains of Soviet military personnel who died in the Soviet liberation of Korea from the Japanese at the tail end of the Second World War. In the center of Chongjin is the typical giant twin statues of the Kims. We were taken there and expected to bow down in veneration to these dead rulers. I declined, but the rest of the group abased themselves to these dictators. The propaganda wall displays announcements about things that the regime wants the populace to know about or to believe in. During a lunch of fish, as was typical, a video was played of the DPRK's military might, the climax of which was missiles being launched. Outside the restaurant, the peasants were painting lines in the road by hand. We visited both a secondary and primary school in Chongjin. The high school students were studying English, so they had a chance in small groups to practice their English with us and hear about our countries.
What do you do for a living?
F. Are you married or single?
The school had lots of propaganda posters celebrating the Korean People's Army's heroic feats in the Korean War and the success of the DPRK's missile program. We next visited a primary school with a playground full of military toys to indoctrinate the children. The military theme carried on inside the school with the picture of a giant missile. The children's show at the school was very professional. Around the Rason Special Economic Zone to see the city of Rajin and Pipha Island before heading to the Tri-Country area and exiting the DPRK by train over the Friendship Bridge into Russia. The DPRK propaganda machine proclaims of the Kim Il-sung orchid that Kim Il-sung's peerless character is fully reflected in the immortal flower, which is blooming everywhere on the 5 continents. We had lunch under the gaze of the Kims while being shown yet another video displaying the prowess of the Korean People's Army. The Rajin Beach Park was largely deserted. The park had a strange collection of animal statues. The gillnet fisherman was proud to show off his catch to the local boys. We drove north along the coast of Pipha Island for a boat trip, which was cancelled due to high winds, so instead I watched a diver collecting shellfish along the shore. The luxurious Emperor Hotel and Casino was built by a Hong Kong-based company for Chinese tourists in 2000. On Pipha Island there is a small army detachment manning an observation point and deteriorating tourist walkways along the coast. It was fascinating to watch the diver, using surface-supplied air, working in the bay to collect a wide variety of shellfish. We visited a Chinese-owned garment factory that was very busy churning out garments for export under the Made in China label, rather than listing North Korea as the country of origin. Presumably, this was done to defeat the sanctions imposed on the DPRK. Human Rights Watch reports that workers in North Korea are routinely exploited, and those workers who do not obey orders are imprisoned in work camps. In Rason, we stayed in a coal-fired hotel in the middle of nowhere so we wouldn't meet any locals. The port of Rajin is Asia's most northerly all-year ice-free port, hence its importance to the Russian Far East. Alongside in the port were 2 of the DPRK's new corvettes still under construction. The hulls are approximately 77 meters long with an emphasis on a modern, reduced radar observable design. The port of Rajin is used for the transshipment of Siberian coal to markets in China, as coal remains the principal fuel for electricity generation at power plants in China. When it was time to exit the DPRK, we drove northeast from Rajin to the tri-country area where the DPRK, China, and Russia conjoin. From a hill overlooking the tri-country area, we could see a high pagoda in China, radar equipment in Russia, as well as the Friendship Railroad Bridge that would take us into Russia and return us to freedom. On the DPRK side of the borders, we could see the watchtowers used to stop defectors from fleeing the country to China. Those who make the attempt risk being shot, or if they are caught, being tortured and sent to a prison camp. At the Tumangan train station, our cameras were again inspected for prohibited pictures, which were deleted if found. We then cleared the DPRK customs prior to boarding a short two-car train to Russia that crossed the Tuman River via the gated Friendship Bridge. After crossing the Friendship Bridge into Russia, the border guards closed the bridge's gate behind us, and we breathed a sigh of relief. Just over the border in Kaesong, Russia, the train stopped for an hour and we were free to wander about. The sense of freedom in Russia was overwhelming, and there was none of the DPRK-style government minders to monitor our movements and incessantly tell us what we could or could not do. It was great to have our freedom restored and the threat of arrest in the DPRK removed. My conclusions from this visit to the DPRK are that 1. The DPRK is a state designed to keep the ruling elite in power and in luxury, regardless of the suffering of the majority of its citizenry. 2. The Kims act as deified leaders to keep the citizenry in line and to accept whatever suffering they are subjected to. 3. The DPRK is totally committed to developing nuclear-tipped ICBMs to warn off any potential adversary, especially the United States. And 4. Living outside of Pyongyang is very difficult for the peasantry.
Take me somewhere nice, to some tired island in your heart called paradise.